In the rugged solitude of the Sinaloa Mountains, on July 15, 2022, a legend came to an end. It wasn't in a spectacular shootout, nor in a luxurious hideout. It was in the undergrowth, among the bushes, where a 69-year-old man, a ghost from a bygone era, was found by a search dog from the Mexican Navy. The dog's name was Max. The man was Rafael Caro Quintero, the narco of narcos, one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, with a $20 million bounty on his head. The operation, carried out by the Navy's elite unit, seemed like a resounding success, the closing of a chapter nearly 4 decades old. But victory came at a devastating cost. Hours after the capture, a Black Hawk helicopter involved in the operation crashed near Los Mochis. 14 of Mexico's most highly trained Marines lost their lives. The official cause, according to preliminary investigations, was lack of fuel, a tragic accident. But the shadow of tragedy loomed over the capture, a bloody reminder that this man's trail has always been marked by death. Who was this man, whose arrest in old age still demanded such a high price in blood? How did a poor farmer from Badiraguato, Sinaloa, become powerful enough to challenge a superpower? To understand the war on drugs as we know it today, its endemic violence, its systemic corruption, its seemingly endless nature, we must go back to its genesis. We must understand how Rafael Caro Quintero ordered the murder of a U.S. federal agent, and in doing so, unleashed a storm of vengeance that has never subsided. This is the story of the crime that changed everything. To understand the rise of figures like Caro Quintero, one must understand the land that gave them birth. In the 1960s and 1970s, Mexico was experiencing the so-called Mexican miracle, a period of economic growth that, however, did not reach the poorest rural areas. In the highlands of Sinaloa, a region that, along with Durango and Chihuahua, forms the Golden Triangle, the state was a distant presence and poverty was a daily reality. Agrarian policies favored large agro-industrialists in the valleys, leaving the mountain peasants without support or opportunities. Migration to the cities offered little more than unemployment and marginalization. In this vacuum of power and economy, an alternative emerged: the cultivation of poppies and marijuana, products with an insatiable demand across the border. It was not a moral choice, but one of subsistence. Rafael Caro Quintero was born into this world on October 24, 1952, in La Noria, Badiraguato, Sinaloa. He was the eldest of 12 siblings in a family dedicated to small-scale farming and ranching. The death of his father when he was just 14 pushed him to take on the role of provider. He worked in the fields, was a rancher and a truck driver, but poverty persisted. Like so many others, he saw drug trafficking not as a path to evil, but as the only visible way out of a life of misery. In the late 1970s, drug trafficking in Mexico underwent a radical transformation. From a network of family clans and independent smugglers, it became a sophisticated and centralized criminal enterprise. This change was the work of 3 men: Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, a cunning former judicial police officer known as the Boss of Bosses; Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, an old-school trafficker; and a young and ambitious Rafael Caro Quintero, the genius behind large-scale production. Together, they founded what U.S. authorities dubbed the Guadalajara Cartel. Their vision was revolutionary: to create a federation that would unite all traffickers, control the routes, the plazas, set prices, and eliminate internal competition. They created a monopoly, a pax mafiosa, that professionalized the business. The real quantum leap for the Guadalajara Cartel came with a geopolitical opportunity. In the early 1980s, the DEA intensified surveillance of Caribbean routes, choking off the main corridor for Colombian cocaine into the United States. The Medellin and Cali cartels desperately needed a new way in. Félix Gallardo, with his already established infrastructure, offered it to them. The deal was transformative. Instead of cash payment for their services, the Mexicans demanded 50% of the cocaine they transported. Overnight, the Guadalajara Cartel went from being a powerful marijuana producer to one of the most important cocaine distributors in the world, amassing a fortune estimated at $5 billion annually. They had become indispensable partners in the global drug trafficking chain. While the Guadalajara empire flourished, one man was delving into its heart. Enrique "Kiki" Camarena, born in Mexicali, was a product of two cultures. A veteran of the United States Marine Corps and a former police officer, he joined the DEA with iron determination. He was charismatic, tenacious, and most importantly, he understood the language and mentality of the world he was meant to infiltrate. In 1981, he was assigned to the DEA office in Guadalajara, the epicenter of the cartel's power, a decision that set him on an inevitable collision course. In Mexico, DEA agents operated under severe restrictions. They could not carry weapons, make arrests, or act as undercover agents in the traditional sense. Their main tool was intelligence, and the source of that intelligence was informants. In this dangerous art, Kiki Camarena was a master. He had a unique ability to win people's trust, to convince terrified men to risk their lives in exchange for information. It was this skill that made him an existential threat to an organization that depended on secrecy and intimidation. Thanks to his network of informants, Camarena began to unravel the true scale of Caro Quintero's empire. The most astonishing discovery was a property in the municipality of Allende, Chihuahua, known as the El Búfalo Ranch. It was no simple ranch. It was a clandestine agro-industrial complex of unprecedented scale. Spanning over 1,000 hectares, it employed nearly 10,000 day laborers, many of them brought from Mexico's poorest states under false pretenses and held at gunpoint in conditions of modern slavery. El Búfalo was the crown jewel of Caro Quintero, a city-state dedicated to the production of high-quality sinsemilla marijuana, with an estimated annual production value of over $8 billion. In November 1984, armed with Camarena's precise intelligence, the Mexican government, pressured by the United States, launched Operation Búfalo. 450 Mexican army soldiers, supported by helicopters, descended on the ranch. What they found exceeded all expectations. Thousands of tons of marijuana were seized and destroyed in what was the most devastating financial blow ever dealt to a drug trafficking organization up to that time. For the Guadalajara Cartel, and particularly for Rafael Caro Quintero, this was more than an economic loss. It was a humiliation, a direct affront to their power and their supposed invulnerability. And in their world, there was only one possible response to such an affront. They knew who was responsible, and his name was Kiki Camarena. On February 7, 1985, at 2 in the afternoon, Enrique Camarena left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. He was going to meet his wife, Mica, for lunch. He left his gun on his desk. As he crossed the street to get his truck, he was intercepted by 5 men. One of them showed him a badge from the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, DFS, Mexico's secret police, and said, "Federal security, the commander wants to see you." It was a trap. The men were cartel hitmen, acting with the complicity of corrupt police officers. Camarena was forced into a vehicle and taken to a house at 881 Lope de Vega Street, a property owned by Rafael Caro Quintero. For the next 30 hours, Kiki Camarena was subjected to hell. He was brutally tortured and interrogated. His captors recorded the sessions on audio tapes, a chilling testament to their cruelty. They beat him, burned his skin with cigarettes, and sexually assaulted him. To ensure the torture could be prolonged, a doctor, Humberto Alvarez Macain, administered drugs to keep him conscious. The questions were relentless. They wanted to know about his informants, about DEA operations, about corruption within U.S. agencies. On the recordings, Camarena can be heard pleading for his life and for the safety of his family. But was the interrogation just revenge for the El Búfalo Ranch? Decades later, former DEA agents and protected witnesses would present a much darker and more complex version of events. They claimed that at the Lope de Vega house were not only the cartel bosses, but also a mysterious Cuban-American operative, whom they identified as Félix Rodriguez. a veteran CIA agent with a long history in covert operations, including the Iran-Contra affair. According to this theory, the real motive for the kidnapping was not the past, but the future. Camarena supposedly had discovered that the CIA was using the Guadalajara Cartel's infrastructure to ship weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua, and in return was allowing the cartel to bring drugs into the United States to finance that secret war. If this was true, Camarena was not killed for what he had done, but for what he was about to reveal. His death was not just an act of revenge by drug traffickers, but a cover-up at the highest level of Cold War geopolitics. A month after the kidnapping, the tortured bodies of Kiki Camarena and his pilot, Alfredo Zavala Avalar, were found in a rural area of Michoacán. The United States response was immediate and furious. The DEA, an investigative agency, transformed into an agency of vengeance. Operation Leyenda was launched, the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history, with a single objective: to hunt down everyone responsible, regardless of their position or nationality. In an unprecedented measure of pressure, the Reagan administration ordered a thorough search of every vehicle crossing the border, paralyzing trade and sending an unequivocal message to the Mexican government. Either you hand over Camarena's killers, or the bilateral relationship is over. The war was no longer against drugs. Now it was personal. Under the immense pressure of Operation Leyenda, the Guadalajara Cartel, an organization that had dominated drug trafficking in Mexico throughout the 1980s, crumbled like a house of cards. Its leaders, men who once believed themselves untouchable, became hunted prey, stalked by Mexican and American authorities. Rafael Caro Quintero, the charismatic and feared narco of narcos, was one of the first to fall. Following the brutal 1985 murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, Caro Quintero fled to Costa Rica, seeking refuge in a tropical paradise where he hoped to evade justice. He was not alone. By his side was Sara Cosillo, a young woman of just 17, the niece of an influential politician from Jalisco. The relationship between them was as scandalous as it was enigmatic, a mixture of power, seduction, and danger that captured the essence of the world in which Caro Quintero reigned. Caro Quintero's hideout in Costa Rica was a luxurious villa surrounded by palm trees overlooking the Pacific Ocean. There, under the scorching sun and the murmur of the waves, he lived a life that seemed torn from a novel. But the illusion of invulnerability quickly vanished. Sarah, trusting in the safety of their refuge, made a fatal mistake. She made a phone call to her family in Guadalajara. The line was tapped. The DEA, which had been tracking the cartel's every move, picked up the signal. On April 4th, 1985, Costa Rican authorities, guided by precise information from the DEA, stormed the villa. When they found Sarah, the agents assumed she was a kidnapping victim, a young woman trapped by a ruthless criminal. Her response, however, left everyone stunned. "I am not kidnapped. I am in love with Caro Quintero." That declaration, uttered with a mixture of defiance and devotion, became a legendary phrase, an echo that would resonate in the annals of drug trafficking history. Caro Quintero was arrested, handcuffed, and extradited to Mexico to face justice. In a trial that captured international attention, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison for the kidnapping and murder of Kiki Camarena, as well as for other drug trafficking charges. For 28 years, the case seemed closed, a concluded chapter in the fight against drug trafficking. Caro Quintero, locked in a cell, became little more than a name in the DEA's files, a trophy from a victory that U.S. authorities celebrated with pride. But the story of the narco of narcos was far from over. In the early hours of August 9th, 2013, the world awoke to news that seemed impossible. Rafael Caro Quintero had been released. An appeals court in Jalisco overturned his sentence based on a legal technicality that unleashed a storm of controversy. The argument was as bold as it was questionable. Since Kiki Camarena was not an officially accredited diplomatic agent, his murder was a common crime and should have been tried by a state court, not a federal one. This decision not only invalidated the judicial process that had kept Caro Quintero behind bars, but also represented a direct affront to the United States. The Department of Justice issued a statement declaring itself extremely disappointed, while the DEA, furious, vowed that it would not rest until Caro Quintero faced charges in an American court. The release was seen as a betrayal, a reminder of the complexities and contradictions of the Mexican judicial system, where corruption and legal loopholes could unlock a cell door. After his release, Caro Quintero vanished like a specter in the night. He became the DEA's most wanted fugitive, a man whose shadow still cast fear and fascination. He returned to the rugged lands of the Sinaloa Mountains, to the same dusty roads that saw him grow up. In a clandestine interview, conducted in some remote corner and broadcast through secret channels, Caro Quintero claimed to be a reformed man, someone who only sought peace after decades of violence. "I'm a farmer now," he said, with a calmness that belied his history. But U.S. intelligence agencies told a very different story. According to their reports, Caro Quintero had not only returned to the drug trade, but had founded a new organization, the Guadalajara Cartel. This new group, they asserted, was waging a brutal territorial war against factions of the Sinaloa Cartel, led by the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, known as Los Chapitos. The Sierra once again became a battlefield, with bullets crossing the air and bodies falling in the dust. The narco of narcos was now a living relic, a vestige of an era when cartels operated with a mix of audacity and discretion. But his legacy was much more than a series of sensational headlines. Operation Leyenda, designed to avenge the death of Kiki Camarena, had succeeded in decapitating the Guadalajara Cartel, but at a devastating cost. Instead of eradicating drug trafficking, the cartel's fall created a power vacuum that unleashed an endless war. The lieutenants of Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo, the mastermind behind the Guadalajara Federation, did not surrender to the pressure from authorities. On the contrary, they seized the opportunity to build their own empires. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman founded the Sinaloa Cartel. The Arellano Félix brothers established the Tijuana Cartel, and Amado Carrillo Fuentes, known as the Lord of the Skies, created the Juarez Cartel, the Pax Mafiosa that Félix Gallardo had maintained with an iron fist disintegrated, giving way to an era of brutal competition and unprecedented violence. The final capture of Rafael Caro Quintero in 2022 marked the end of a manhunt that had lasted for decades. But the price was high. During the operation, a Mexican Navy helicopter crashed, killing 14 Marines who had risked everything to bring the narco of narcos to justice. The tragedy was a grim reminder of the human cost of the war on drugs. For many, Caro Quintero's capture was a bittersweet triumph, a partial closure to a chapter that had left indelible scars in Mexico and beyond. Caro Quintero's legacy is a paradox. On one hand, his capture in 1985 and subsequent release in 2013 exposed the frailties of the Mexican judicial system and the inability of authorities to keep the major kingpins at bay. On the other hand, his criminal life, marked by ambition and cruelty, helped shape the landscape of modern drug trafficking. The destruction of the Guadalajara Cartel did not end the problem. Instead, it atomized power, creating a multi-headed hydra. The cartels that rose from its ashes, Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, became more violent, more decentralized, and more difficult to combat. The territorial war that Caro Quintero unleashed upon returning to the business in the 2010s was merely a continuation of a cycle he himself had helped to start in 1985. The death of Kiki Camarena, an agent who dared to challenge the cartel on its own turf, created a martyr and a myth. His murder galvanized the DEA, turning Operation Leyenda into a personal crusade for many agents. But it also unleashed a spiral of violence that has consumed Mexico for generations. The 14 Marines who died in 2022 are just the latest victims of a story that began in a house on Lope de Vega Street in Guadalajara, where Camarena was tortured and killed. Every capture, every confrontation, every headline about drug trafficking carries the echo of that fateful day. In the end, the capture of Rafael Caro Quintero did not resolve the fundamental questions his life poses. Was it justice for Kiki Camarena? Perhaps, but the real question is whether the cycle of violence that began with his revenge can ever be broken. Mexico remains trapped in an endless war, where every captured kingpin is replaced by another, where every destroyed cartel gives way to a new one. Caro Quintero, with his charisma, his cruelty, and his ability to evade justice, wrote the first pages of this book, but the ending, if it ever comes, has yet to be written.